In my last lecture, I was talking about presidential reconstruction, and presidential reconstruction, where the president rules the policy, is run by Lincoln until Lincoln's assassinated in April of 1865. When Lincoln's assassinated, he is succeeded in the presidency by Andrew Johnson, which begs the question is, who is Andrew Johnson? Andrew Johnson is, surprisingly enough, a Democratic senator from Tennessee in 1860. However, he is a Democratic senator from Tennessee. When his state secedes, he essentially secedes from his state. He remains in the U.S. Senate. So how in the world does Andrew Johnson end up as Lincoln's vice presidential candidate? In 1860, when Lincoln won the election, his vice president was a man named Hannibal Hamlin from Maine, answer to a trivia question that most people don't know. But in 1864, Lincoln and the Republican Party changed strategy. Lincoln runs, as many of you wrote on your second exam, as part of the National Union Party. So Lincoln's plan in 1864, first of all, it's a little surprising to have a presidential election during a war. We take it for granted today that we never stop the elections, but people were a little surprised in 1864 to have an election. Lincoln has an election or agrees to participate in a presidential election, and what he decides to do is to emphasize the big tent of his party. He decides that he's going to emphasize the inclusive nature and that his party is for the Union, for victory in the Civil War. It's not the Republican Party. It's not simply about partisan politics. It's the idea we're going to move beyond partisan politics. So in an effort to show how his party represents the entire Union and not just a sectional Republican Party, they rebrand the party the National Union Party. And what better way to emphasize that it's a National Union Party is that Lincoln, a Northern Republican, chooses his vice president to be Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat. Seems like a great idea at the time. Nobody anticipates that Johnson will become president, but it seems like really it's there to sort of balance and emphasize a point here. Little they know that that point's going to come back and hurt them in 1865. Now, we all know Lincoln's regarded as one of the best presidents ever. Pretty much no matter when you see a poll, you always see him in the top 5, sometimes the top 1, sometimes number 2, but certainly ranked as one of the greatest presidents in the United States. But as some scholars mention, the reason he's the greatest president of the United States, considered one of the greatest presidents of the United States, is that he wins his re-election and the Civil War ends in the North's favor. Well, it's not always clear that he's going to win re-election. If he was a one-term president who had ended his term in 1864 before the war was necessarily gone entirely in the Union's favor, he might have not have been remembered so favorably. And in fact, at some point, Lincoln believes that he is going to lose the election. In August of 1864, you see this quote here, Lincoln gets his cabinet together and basically makes them sign a document sight unseen. So they put their signature on the bottom of a page, and they don't know what they've signed. And what they sign is a document that Lincoln writes, "This morning, as for some days past, it is exceedingly probable this administration will not be reelected. It'll be my duty to cooperate with the president-elect." So the idea is that his cabinet, when he loses, would have to cooperate with the president-elect. So we really want to look at this election because we're really surprised, and the results bear it out, that Lincoln seems to be winning in a landslide. Why in the world would Lincoln be this concerned in August? And trust me, he is that concerned in August. The Democrats in 1864 nominate George McClellan, the famous general who had trained the army, lots of loyal soldiers there. McClellan had been sort of sacked by Lincoln for not being strong enough, for not being active enough in his campaigns against the South, but he still has a very good reputation. The Democrats faced their own problems in 1864. Democrats tend to be divided between war Democrats and peace Democrats. Now, essentially, you could argue they both want peace. But war Democrats said, you know what we need to achieve victory, peace through the Union, and as long as the Union's restored, slavery, no slavery, not important, but we just want the Union restored. Peace Democrats said, no, what we need to do first is declare a truce, negotiate the South back into the Union, and then we'll see what happens. So war Democrats want the war to end victoriously and then a reunion. Peace Democrats want peace first and then a reunion, a negotiated reunion. Now, most people realize the peace Democrats were rather over-optimistic. Once you declared a truce in the war, once you said we're going to spend 3 months or 6 months or 9 months trying to renegotiate the South back in the Union, how easy is it going to be to restart that war once those 3 or 6 months are up? And the answer is probably not very easy. So the peace Democrats really, their opponents would always say, they were basically in favor of defeat. They were going to give up the war. Well, the Democrats nominate, to sort of satisfy both wings of their party, they nominate McClellan, who's a war Democrat. McClellan might not care about slavery one way or another, but he wants the Union to win. Remember, he cares about his army, he cares about his soldiers, he's a general. So they nominate a war Democrat on a peace Democratic platform. So essentially they call the war a failure. They call for a negotiated peace. Interestingly enough, so you have McClellan, the candidate, a war Democrat, running under a platform that's a peace Democratic platform. McClellan basically just decides he's going to ignore the platform and run as he sees fit. There are a lot of key issues in this race. First of all, there's loyalty. The idea Lincoln and his supporters will continually to portray the Democratic Party as disloyal. They're the party that wants to lose the war. Here's sort of the McClellan view here in the screen here. It's the Lincoln and Davis and the McClellans in the middle. That Lincoln and Davis are fighting like children here, tearing up the map here. But if you get a nice sound mind, a nice compromise candidate, that'll get this sorted out, and the United States won't be literally torn apart, as you see here. So the perceived loyalty of the Democrats is one category. And there's this whole idea, and this will come up in the Reconstruction period as well, maybe not all Democrats are traitors, but all traitors are Democrats would be kind of slogan you would see here. And the second issue that comes up in this campaign is race. We talk about Lincoln, did he act too fast? Did he act too slow? Who freed the slaves? But one of the things the Democrats seized upon is the idea, and this is something that came about from the antebellum period before the Civil War, Republicans are in favor not just of ending slavery, but they're in favor of equal rights, which sounds horrible. No, certainly it probably sounded horrible in 1864 context, but also that Republicans are in favor of race mixing. And how do they know that? Well, they had proof. The proof's right here in this pamphlet from 1864. Abraham Lincoln himself was, according at least in terms of this pamphlet, was part African American himself. So, of course, a leader who was part African American, who was a mixed race leader, would want mixed race mixing. And they even coined a term. Today we use the term miscegenation to talk about racially mixed. Well, the term miscegenation is born in 1864. It's one of those pseudo-scientific terms. It did not exist before 1864, but they essentially come up with this pamphlet here, miscegenation. So the idea is that this is what the Republicans stand for. They stand for race mixing. Now, of course, Lincoln is not part African American. Lincoln did not advocate for race mixing. Most people would say that Lincoln probably didn't actually advocate for the equality of the races. But this becomes one of the Democrats' most effective tools. This idea that Republicans don't simply want to end slavery, which may or may not be bad enough, but they're arguing for racial equality, and they're arguing for African American men, these former slaves, will move up to the north and marry your white daughters, and what terrible tragedy that would be. Another issue that is used in this, so sort of already alluded to this is the idea that the Republicans argue that you have McClellan sort of trying to ride two horses. You can't ride two horses. He's a war Democrat and a peace Democrat. Which is he? You have to pick one or the other. So here he is trying to achieve this incredible balance here, but that balance can't be done. Another issue I list there is the issue of prisoners of war. Up until 1863, 1864, prisoners of war were exchanged during the conflict. If the Union captured 5,000 Confederates and the Confederates captured 5,000 Union soldiers, they would simply trade them off. They'd say 5,000 for 5,000, everybody can go back, they can fight again. Of course, it didn't always work out that way. The Union might capture 5,000 Confederate soldiers, and the Confederates capture 1,000 Union soldiers. Well, what would be done in that case? What was done in that case generally is whichever side captured more would send those soldiers home on parole, essentially on the honor system. So you'd return to Vicksburg, Mississippi, you'd return to Atlanta, Georgia, and you'd be a prisoner, but you'd be living at home until you received official notification that you'd been exchanged. Once you were exchanged, then you could rejoin the army. But until then, you were not supposed to fight again. And if it was discovered you were fighting when you were technically a prisoner of war, sort of under house arrest, you could argue, although nobody's enforcing such a house arrest, then you could be executed for that. This exchange system works pretty well. The problem is after the Emancipation Proclamation, when Lincoln agrees to arm African American soldiers, the Confederates say they're not going to honor this prisoner of war exchange anymore. because they're going to treat African Americans not as legitimate prisoners of war, but they're going to treat African Americans as escaped slaves, fugitive slaves who could be re-enslaved. They're going to threaten to execute white Union officers who are leading African American troops. And so in response, Lincoln, and subsequently Lincoln and Grant, will say, that's it. We're going to end prisoner of war exchanges at this point. And this causes tremendous suffering. You hear about things like Andersonville, the famous prisoner of war camp in Georgia, where thousands of soldiers die. In New York, Elmira, you have another prisoner of war camp for Confederates there, where thousands of Confederates die. And there are some people who make the argument that this is part of Grant and Lincoln's plan. If both sides have 30,000 prisoners, well, the Confederates having 30,000 prisoners in the North, that's going to hurt them a lot more because they need every man they can get. They have fewer soldiers than the Union having 30,000 soldiers as prisoners in Georgia. So one of the things Democrats emphasize is this POW issue. Here you have another idea of the Democratic Party having two faces here. You have McClellan there, two-faced here, and different people holding. There's a Union soldier who's miffed at McClellan. Here it is somebody he thought was his leader, and he's not. Here you have the Irish Democratic voter, generally in political cartoons in the 1860s. If you see a guy with a club who with a monkey face, he's an Irishman, because Irish people have monkey faces and clubs. As I'm half Irish, I can attest to you. You rarely see my club or my monkey face, but it's there. Who else supports McClellan? The devil, of course. Jefferson Davis, and some leading hostile Democratic senators also support McClellan. But ultimately, the issue that will become most important in the 1864 election is the war in 1864. And that's where I'm going to pick up in my next lecture.